This was a great paper also, Ethan. I'm excited to talk about it. The first thing, the big thing I really would like to talk about with you is how do I want to word this? If we can't use reason to arrive at what's good or right or true, how can we be confident in what we believe is good, right, and true?
So for me, when I think about ethics, I think about it in a very similar way to Aristotle. So I think of virtues as being a mean, and I think that we'll know when we reach something that's good because it'll make us happy. I think that, like I said, it's a lot like what Aristotle believes, and I think that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that, I use the example of Augustine's mother, and that is one case in which faith made her a lot happier, and so I think that was one case in which faith was good, or faith was used for good.
So we can have confidence that what we have faith in is something good if we are made happy?
Yeah, if we're made happier because of it, I think.
Could we ever be made happy by having faith in something that wasn't good?
I think the problem is there needs to be a distinction between what's good and then what's true, because you can have faith in different religions, and there could be multiple religions that have good moral systems, but it can't be that multiple of them are true. So I think that you can have that faith, and I think that if you have a faith in a certain religion and it teaches you a good morality, you can say that religion or that faith is good, but then it's a lot harder to say that it's true, which is why I kind of more talked about the good rather than the true. So that's a whole other thing. It's a lot harder.
Okay, were you about to say
I
something?
mean, I guess so through faith, I cannot discover something as true. I can only discover something as good.
Yeah, I think so.
I guess I was wondering this when you were mentioning Augustine's mother,
Right.
because she was made happy by her son's conversion,
Mm-hmm.
but that one's difficult to understand as significantly different than, or it's hard to understand as something divine.
Can you speak a little more to
that? Well, I was gonna go with cheeseburgers. But I think I don't know. I really like seeing my little brother, and I really enjoy when I see him when he's in town.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't indicate something about the divine to me, or the goodness of the divine.
Oh,
in the same way
saying.
that she begins to feel comfortable with her son's choices does not
Okay.
necessarily indicate something about what's true. It
So-
just indicates how she feels.
Right. So are you kind of saying that the fact that she's made happy by it isn't necessarily related to the divine, kind of?
It would seem that way to me.
Okay. So the reason I use that example is because I think it's a very interesting example, because not only does it show Augustine coming to faith, which I think is kind of where the divine comes in, but I also think that in a way she had faith that Augustine would come to faith, if that makes sense. Which isn't necessarily faith in the divine, but I think that faith doesn't necessarily have to be in the divine.
So there's an element of her own faith
Mm-hmm.
in his conversion.
Yeah, that's why that example is really interesting to me, because I think that both parties have faith in different things relating to that situation. But to answer your question about the divine, I think that the divine comes into play in that situation for Augustine, because he is coming to faith to that divine, and then I think that the mother's happiness is because of the faith. Maybe it is a little bit different, because it's not happiness that comes from her own faith necessarily, but happiness that comes from someone else's faith. But I think that's kind of why I use that example.
So the happiness indicates the goodness.
Right, yeah. The goodness of his conversion. Yeah.
Her happiness or his happiness?
Right, that's kind of hard. I mean, I think like both of them became happier through it because Augustine was no longer a sensualist, but I kind of really focused in on his mother's happiness for that example. Just because she really, I mean, she did wait for like 30 years because she had that dream that she tells him about, that he would come to faith before she was dead. And then he ends up coming to, isn't she, I'm trying to remember. If I remember correctly, isn't she like on her deathbed or something, like when he comes to faith, or she dies pretty soon after, I think. But anyway, she gets to live to see her son come to faith, and she waited for like 30 years for him to do that. So.
Is it, if a conversion makes somebody unhappy,
right,
is that an indication I should take seriously? If Augustine's mother had been a Zoroastrian, and the day that he converted to Christianity was the worst day of her life, should that tell me something about his faith?
Right, yeah, it's kind of tricky because the example that's given in the book is one where both end up being happy, but I do think that the happiness of the person who, when you're coming to faith, I think your own happiness is more important than the happiness of those around you. But I also think that, so if Augustine came to faith and he became happy because of it, and his mother didn't, or his mother was unhappy because of it, I think Augustine's happiness outweighs his mother's unhappiness. But I would say the same thing if Augustine converted and he became unhappy because of it, and his mother was happy. I would say that his unhappiness was more important or more valid than his mother's happiness.
So the happiness of the individual with faith
Right.
is the litmus test of whether or not what they have faith in is good.
Yeah, I think so. And then the happiness of those around them is just kind of like a bonus, I guess. So yeah, right.
I found the title interesting. I'm going to come from the engineer perspective. When I first saw the topic, I was just like, good, not necessarily found in the rational. And so as an engineer, I'm like, well, it has to be rational, it has to be good. So, but it was interesting, it just has to make sense, it has to be logical. But what really struck me when I was reading through, you said things with respect to faith in God is not part of this human nature and thus is not necessarily rational. It says, therefore, faith in God is not part of this human nature and thus is not necessarily rational. And the first thing that came to mind to me is funerals. And for some reason, at some funerals, people are, of course, sad, but other people actually rejoice. And so when I read your title, I thought, that's interesting, because it's not rational to celebrate at a funeral sometimes.
Right.
But for some people, it is a release. It was, this person is no longer in pain.
They're in a better place.
So where were you going with the title? What did that mean to you? Why did you pick that to be?
Well, the reason why I chose that for the title is because, like I said in my speech, when I first kind of came to that realization, it was mind-boggling, I would say. It was very, it was just such an interesting proposition because throughout my life until I kind of got into maybe 11th grade or so, I was always very much like, it has to be logical, it has to be rational, it has to, can't have any fallacies, it's got to be, it's got to be a perfect argument. But then I kind of realized that that I think there are things that are good that can't necessarily be reached in a logical way.
I see.
I mean, I think most virtues, like I don't think there's necessarily a logical way to, like, reach an absolute virtue or something like that. But I do think that those absolute virtues exist, and so I think that we have to find other ways to explore them. And I think that faith is a great method.
And do you think as a result you always have that answer, so to speak? Like, I got toward the end of your paper, I'm thinking, oh, he's going to have an answer for me at the end, and then you end with a question. I'm like, shoot, thanks a lot. So, it seemed like there was a journey that you were on when you were writing the paper.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it sounds like it was a
Yeah.
journey you've been over for the past several years. So it
Oh,
just
yeah.
seems, I literally wrote, wow, you left us hanging here, thanks a lot. But is that part of it? Is it really, like you said, I think you touched on it a little bit before, is it that journey that gets us to a better understanding as we go, or is there a final answer destination that you think we're gonna get to?
So, you're gonna hate me. I'm gonna kind of combine your two answers
Okay.
in mine. I'm gonna say I definitely think there is an absolute virtue, and so I think there is that answer. I think it's out there, but I don't think that we can necessarily reach it.
Okay.
I think that we can use faith as a way to approach it maybe and get closer and become better. I definitely think that anyone has the ability to become better, but I also think that I don't think that anyone can be perfect. Everyone's gonna have their flaws. So
I kind of want to go back to the happiness thing.
okay.
It's hard to go.
Oh, go for it.
Okay, so if we can know if an individual's faith is right or in the right thing by whether or not they experience happiness. What do we do with martyrs?
Mm.
You know, or you see these paintings of the
Right.
agony in their faces. Do they not have faith in the right thing, or?
I would argue that I think that martyrs are some of the happiest people that there are, because I think that, yeah, I know that sounds really weird, but I think that it's because martyrs are people who obviously have a lot of faith, and not only do they have a lot of faith, but I think that most martyrs, I would say their life is their faith, probably. I mean, if they care enough about their faith to die for it, then that means that that faith is something very important to them. And I think that if they're dying for their faith, I think that's the only way that they would want to go. I don't think that a martyr would want to die in their sleep. I don't think a martyr would want to die in war. I think that someone who cares that much about their faith would want to die for their faith. So I think that in dying for their faith, I think that they're happier for it.
They're choosing to die for their faith. So.
Right. I mean, because they could renounce their faith and then they would probably be allowed to live, but if they did that, then I think it would show that they don't care as much about their faith.
So dying with a purpose is better than living without one.
Right.
So, okay. You've called Augustine a centralist a couple times already today. But then you have this quote on page 17, the very top of Augustine shows how faith can make someone happy, as he constantly talks about how much he loves God, and even more so, how much he loves loving God. I wonder how much Augustine actually changed in terms of being a pleasure seeker, if you will. Did he change from being a pleasure seeker?
That's a tricky one. I think I would say that seeking pleasure can be good, because I think that him loving God is better than him going to the bathhouses every day and trying to pleasure himself that way, or other ways like stealing or something like that. I think that he still will follow and do what he loves or what he enjoys. But I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. I was using sensualist more. I guess I don't know, that's interesting, because then I wonder, are we all sensualists if we all seek after what we enjoy most? But I was using it kind of in a way meaning that he's seeking bad pleasures, but that makes me wonder if we're all sensualists in a way, which is kind of a scary thought.
Depending on how you define it.
Yeah, right. So I don't know, but I guess it does seem like maybe he didn't change how he chooses what to go after, but he changed what he's going after.
How does that relate with your definition of when we can be certain in our faith?
Can you explain this?
So the definition I've reiterated a couple times about now I forget what I said. How happiness.
Right, okay.
Can you connect those?
So are you asking me to connect like Augustine going after like him not really changing how he chooses what to follow, and then connecting that to the idea of happiness, kind of, and like searching for what
Well,
is
you
happy.
said
The person's happiness being important and deciding the good, kind of. Well, I think that those kind of make sense, because if a person is following, and I think that what they enjoy can not necessarily be what makes them happy, like truly happy, because I think that there is a difference between pleasures and happiness, which again goes back to the Aristotle, but I think that difference is very important, because in happiness I think one will find pleasure, but in pleasure one will not necessarily find happiness, I think. So that's the really important distinction to make. And I think that by choosing to follow God, he's maybe closer to the happiness, but I think he's still searching after that pleasure. So I guess I would connect them by saying that even though he's not changing how he chooses what to follow, because he's still going after what he enjoys, I think that you can still consistently do that, but choose something that makes you happier. That was a lot. That was kind of super random, but I don't know if it made sense. Do you want me to repeat that, or?
Could you clarify for me the distinction between pleasure and happiness?
So I think that a pleasure is something that makes us feel good, and I think that happiness is something that is good. So I think that which is good will make us feel good, but I also think that which makes us feel good is not necessarily truly good.
What do you mean by feel good? I can think of a lot of, the Desert Fathers, for instance. I doubt they felt very good, or at least in the way that I would think about that.
Right.
That
Well, I think
hard
that
living
right.
isn't comfortable. But am I misunderstanding what
Well,
pleasure is?
I think feeling good can mean a lot of things. I think it can mean it physically feels good, or I think it can mean it stimulates your soul in a good way, and maybe we could also say that's a distinction between pleasure and happiness. That pleasure is something that either that can make you feel good and or like stimulate your soul or your mind, whereas happiness would probably be something more that just stimulates your soul or your mind. But I don't know, because I also think that doing something physical can make you happy. Like if you play a sport or something and it really like makes you happy, then I think. So I don't know. I don't know how much I agree with what I just said. But yeah, so I think that is, so yeah. So feeling good, to summarize, feeling good can be, I think, physical or mental or in your soul. So while those Desert Fathers may not have felt good physically, I think that their souls were being stimulated very strongly.
Okay. see. And so is it that experience of happiness, so it's that experience of happiness or pleasure that gives us a confidence in what we believe?
Right. Well,
There's-
yeah, right. Especially with like happiness, but it is hard to distinguish between happiness and pleasure. I think.
Yeah.
If it's happening to you,
Mhm.
I think that is tricky, but I think you can start by ruling out pleasures that you know are not good.
Yeah. I think so.